Okay, looks like we are running. Let us kick our show off. Welcome to Evolution Hour on December 9th, 2024. Hours of the morning where I am. And remember, we have a website which has some delicious old material that you can share widely, freely, without any concerns. Okie doke. Back in Spokane, as you can see from the background. Ta-da! Isn't that exciting? And for the next couple of weeks, we'll be here, and then we'll have another little visit to Seattle, and then back again for the new year of 2025 as shit begins to hit fan with the new Trump administration. But we won't be going into that. Instead, we will be resuming our discussion of shit hitting fan on Titans, our little cute little creationist book. And of course, this bi-weekly installment of our 800 plus Luskin papers on junk DNA. Spoiler alert, still nothing new on the notion that most ALUs and such like, hello Barbara, are in fact functional. Let me make sure my little chat's popping up. Okay, we got that in there, and that's in the overlay. There we go. So, there was a little taxa, an old fish from the Devonian called Gogonasus that I had not really known about. I had some papers that were alluding to it on the sideline, but fortunately, because of the mess burrowing through the source field in Sarfati and Tay's book, it turned up some interesting little stuff that I will be sharing with you. They cite a paper by Motani et al. In 2014 from PLOS one that I'll be putting a link up to, which is about ichthyosaurs giving live birth. And the only reason why Sarfati and Tay are bringing it up is to waive the idea that there is something mysteriously catastrophic about the deposition and how it could get preserved. More on that in a minute. The rapid burial trope. And the opportunity for them to pose the idea that live birth evolving many times in a variety of organisms is somehow a problem for evolution, which meant that they were going on to cite quite a few of their own in-house apologetics again. So there's a 2008 post from Catchpool and Jonathan Sarfati, The Oldest Pregnant Mum Not, which I'll be putting a link up to, which Sarfati and Tay are actually citing in their context. And that turns out to be kind of a fun little daisy chain, because they're citing along the way a piece by Jaranek and Doyle on Gogonasus, A Fish with Human Limbs, which is originally in the Journal of Creation. But the intriguing thing about it is that the link that's in this post doesn't end up at the Journal of Creation article. It ends up with a posting that's a year earlier by Daniel Anderson and Sean Doyle, basically pretty much the same stuff that's in the other piece. Now, that brings up the issue, is Daniel Anderson a pseudonym of Yaransik, or maybe they're completely different people, and Doyle did this bit and then revamped it with a different author for the Journal of Creation? I don't know the particulars on that. If somebody like Joel Duff or somebody that's a little more familiar with some of the little skivvy on this matter as to whether or not he's a pseudonym, let me know on it, because pseudonyms do pop up a lot. John Woodmarapp is a pseudonym. Steve Austin had an anagram of his name, I think something or other Nevins, that he posted a lot of early creationist stuff on back in the 80s and 90s, and then he decided to go under his regular name, Steve Austin, which is not to be confused with the wrestler Steve Austin or the $6 million man Steve Austin. So I don't know, maybe you should have stuck with Nevins. But at any rate, I'll be putting a link up to the creation.com version, as well as one to the 2007 Journal of Creation version, so that you can plow through that and have fun to enjoy. Here, we're dealing with a little bit different matter, which is more about this fossil fish and the context of it. So, it certainly was not the case that Sarfati and Tay were going to link any technical literature that allowed anybody to understand all of that stuff. They're dealing with the issue about the hand, the digit parts, which are still fishy in Gogonasus. Although what turned out to be kind of interesting was one of the various authors involved in the technical work, John Long, wrote an article in 2011 on evolution, missing links, and climate change that ended up, actually 2012, it ended up in an anthology. But what was intriguing about it was a illustration that showed the bones of Gogonasus if you scale them up to match a human being. Human being on the one side, and then the funky looking critter that's about the same height. You'll notice how eerily similar that is. Some of the bones, of course, are slightly different shaped, but the number of bones that are in exactly the same position and exactly the same articulation before you get to the little hands and feet, which are fins in the case of Gogonasus, shows how little evolutionary change or modification was required to take the basic layout of these Devonian fish and morph them over time into land tetrapods. Needless to say, that's not coming up in Sarfati and Tay's version. There's a 2009 paper that we'll be pulling up from Holland and Long on Gogonasus phylogeny, and yet another work that's not cited by Sarfati and Tay, Long and Trinajastic 2010, going into very great detail on the taphonomy of the formation, exactly how all the little deposits worked out. It's not big slosh catastrophic. It would be amusing to kind of see any of the creationists try to actually show that the forensic details in the 2010 paper don't work. But Sarfati and Tay aren't getting to that stage. It's way behind the curve on that. Now then, we'll be bringing up to the exciting world of our Luskin stuff. A preface on this element. Remember, we have been pointing out frequently how nobody is disputing the fact that some retrotransposons, some little short non-coding RNA, have some functionality in the genome. But as Dan Stern Cardinale and others have pointed out in their various venues, some don't mean most, let alone all. And the trope that occurs with the Discovery Institute, and to some extent with Reasons to Believe, because that was some of the interaction that various people have been having over the years on this, is that only a tiny proportion, 1 or 2% of each of these categories, are ending up being functional, and the rest are just foam on the beer, retrotransposons and junk DNA that's either pseudogenes from older genetic material that's gotten deactivated, or, as in the case of our little ALU retrotransposon, an invading genetic element that has a copy me signal and expands and expands and expands in the system, and the system has to figure out how to respond to it. And to some extent, because ALUs can cross-link so neatly, that in some cases they become like a handy little trigger bit to allow you to, the organism to locate stuff and bend and twist and warp things that sets up brand new connections over quite a great genetic distance. It's really a fascinating bunch of stuff that is in the papers that aren't necessarily being covered by our cute little Luskin list. But we'll start off with one that does. Bezecchi et al. 2022, which is on the MR205 HG leader long non-coding RNA from 2022. And that's an open stocky thingy that I will be presenting for you. It's particularly useful in that it has a breakdown of what the molecule looks like and how big chunks of it are formed from the ALU element, and then a bunch of other stuff that forms other parts of this chain. So it's pulling this little thing apart and creating like a conformation that allows these little scanning systems inside the genome that hunt up for connections to make connections. Fine and dandy, absolutely fascinating stuff. It still doesn't mean that most ALUs are doing that in the genome. But following up on this, led to a bunch of works that were being discussed in this paper on how the biology is reacting to these ALUs. And it involves a little detail that's kind of a rarity in genetics, which is a triplex layering. Everybody knows about the little duplex bits and single-stranded RNA and DNA. And sometimes you can form even bigger things. Some of the DNA operates as single strand, and some of it, the normal stuff that's encoding, is double-stranded, but it also can form triple-stranded elements. So this layer cake of formation. And so they mentioned a bunch of different papers, which I'll be putting the links up to. Profumo et al. 2019 and Senturk-Setten et al. 2019 and a 2021 paper by Tassinari, none of which are showing up on the Luskin list. So why are they not delving into all these little funky biddles? Curiously enough, one of the papers that seemed relevant on this matter of the formation of the system does show up on the Luskin list later on. And that's a 2021 paper from Bai, which was cited by this work, curiously enough, as partially in contrast with these and our results are the findings by Bai et al. 2021, who reported ALU enrichment in RNA-DNA hybrids, R-loops, but depletion in DNA, and RNA and DNA triplexes. In other words, that the hypothesis that they were testing out in this main paper, that these triplex things have a really great enrichment of ALUs, was not entirely true, that in certain contexts that wasn't the case. Well, why then were the Luskin list going out of their way to include it on their list? I think it's because it had ALU in the title. And so they're trawling through incoming technical papers. None of these other papers that they were dealing with had that, even though they were discussing triplexes and other stuff, but it wasn't bringing up the ALU. So is it possible that the compilers of the Discovery Institute list are riffing too superficially off of titles, maybe poking for a half a second into the abstract, but not really delving into the content of the paper much? This would be consistent with what we've been seeing over the last weeks, delving into this, and we're now about 10% of the way through their list. And we'll be seeing whether or not this hypothesis continues as we plow down through the rest of them. The vast majority of the papers we're going to be going into over the next weeks will be more ALU stuff. In fact, when I went through the initial listing of this thing, I was highlighting in green, bold, the papers that have ALU, so they'll stand out on my listing in the doc file that I created as a mirror of this to keep track of all the material on. So that Mir 205 bunch, which remember is the topic of that one paper that does show up on the Discovery Institute list, is an interesting element, because when I find an item like that that's not showing up in my reference field under that name, it means that I don't necessarily have a lot of technical works on the topic. And so I'm kind of curious to see, A, what new material has been generated on making sense of that thing, and 2, are they putting material on that in the other parts of the list? Now, once in a while, a topic actually does trigger off some additional papers on the Luskin list, but not this time. Nothing. Absolute zip, nada. Which then brings to mind why. So there's a nice little paper from 2020 on Bonferrari and Gandolini, unveiling the ups and downs of Mir 25 in physiology and cancer, and showing how finicky the system is and how it can glitch up and form malfunctions relatively easily because of the little murky nature of the connections on here. This is that notion of kludges, which is the kind of funkiness that you get into a lot of design on stuff that's not designed, that is evolved. It's not lean and mean and efficient and tidy. It has a thing that causes a potential problem, so they have to have a compensation mechanism that evolves to deal with the problem that arose because you had a system that has a glitch ability to begin with. And then there is a 2024 paper from Lee et al., which is on similar bits. Inverted ALU repeats friends or foes in the human transcriptome, which also goes into a pile of stuff on their part in, quote, in the pathogenesis of human diseases, unquote. Again, exploring how the systems wrangle with the fact that they've got all these bloody ALUs showing up in the system, and it has to somehow compensate for them, and it gets stuck into modalities that makes it work halfway decently. Remember, ALUs have been knocking around in the hominid line for certainly millions of years, and so there's been lots of opportunity for things to happen. And as we've encountered it occasionally in some of the earlier installments, little bits of the ALUs have turned functional up in our brains, and they actually have a dynamic characteristics. Again, it's only a small proportion of the 1.4 million and counting ALUs. But anyway, I think it'll be a rather interesting bit because you'll learn even more about all the little fun and game stuff. And there, in these various papers, the two that are explicitly on the Luskin list, neither one of them can be said to support the notion that the majority, as in 50% or more, of ALUs are actually intentionally doing anything in the system. Only that they can occasionally come up with stuff that needs to be dealt with by the biology. This triplex matter is therefore something like that feature that we were noticing in some earlier episodes, how the ALUs can lock up together inverted and form loops. And it's the reason why we don't have tails, because it's bypassed the functionality of that gene. Well, just imagine that going on all through the genome where there are ALUs, and you can get a sense of all of that. How Luskin can imagine that any of this is supporting a designer model, let alone the interesting bit in the room, which is the chronology issue. One of the things that I would love to have people keep in mind when they're dealing with intelligent design is how absolutely vacuous their non-model is. At no point will you ever see a designer saying, here is what we think happened and when we think it happened, and here's the evidence for why we think it happened and how we can explain this data field way better than evolutionary biology can. Those are not conversations that come up in the design movement. At least you get a faux version of it with the standing for truth type people over in young earth creationism, where they will be channeling the arguments of a Jensen or a Sanford and bringing up the information that they are presenting, or the little funky bits that you get with Sal Cordova and some of the little arguments that he's been making about basal biological systems. But they're, of course, running from a young earth creationist perspective. But that is a problem when you're in that compacted time frame, that you now have to start thinking, when did all of this stuff occur, and how would you be able to isolate what exactly do you think is going on in a design context? My contention would be that the intelligent design movement is never going to get to that stage. At least the young earth creationists can ram everything into their big slosh model, where they're going to run into problems, as Joel Duff likes to point out, when you look at particular examples of things. Dapper Dino has done the same thing in context, and we'll be alluding to some of that in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, by the way. But you don't really get anywhere near that level in old earth creationism, reasons to believe style stuff, or the intelligent design movement, Discovery Institute class of things. There is no there. There's only an anti-model. And so we'll be seeing more and more of the technical fields and stuff. I'm sure my prediction is that we're going to be cycling through the same level of superficial citation. Remember, the Discovery Institute list has no annotations. Sometimes you get stuff in some of the older material that even Luskin put up like 10, 15 years ago. You would find annotations and commentaries as to why they think this is important information. We're not getting it in that mode at all. So this attempt to just kind of barrage, there's going to be one that will be popping up as sort of a sidebar from Jonathan McClatchy, where he sort of bumps into some of the same material that is on the Luskin list. And so when we get down to that a little bit later on in the series, I'll be including some stuff in on the McClatchy end of it, which, surprise, surprise, it's not supporting the case for things either. So anyway, that gets us up to speed on that front. There were some interesting little tidbits that came up that remind us of how stuff that you're looking for in one area for a completely different purpose can end up having an intriguing sidebar thing. I wasn't anticipating that my research was going to bump into a topic that in content for Rocks for the Volume 2. But as it turns out, in hunting around for the kind of politics involving, believe it or not, the Russian-British concerns 1870s. This was the area that I was dealing with in terms of research. And there was this fellow, Van Berry, who was an itinerant spy, scholar, traveler, who had great relationships. He could dress up like a dervish and wander around and visited Baghdad and places all over the Islamic world. And he was acting as kind of a spy to filter some information to look at what the Russians were doing and what the British were doing and what the attitudes of the local people were and all of that kind of stuff. Turns out that there wasn't really anything that was directly helpful for my novel, but along the way, there was this fascinating incident where he's describing having visited Mount Ararat in the 1860s. All of this material of the done up in the 80s, and this was referring to material that he'd been doing much later. And he was talking about how at that time, 1860s, how there were all these people that were insisting they had pieces of Noah's Ark, and they were insisting that there was a full ark or pieces of it on the top of Mount Ararat with a lake, or that not only that, there were at least 4 other areas not on Mount Ararat at all where people were also insisting that they had pieces of the ark. And so this was just a reminder. This turned out to be a beautiful setup paragraph for the time when in the early 20th century you get yet more isolated examples of people who keep on adding to the daisy chain telephone game mythology lore surrounding the Mount Ararat thing. A little spoiler alert, that get out to time are relying on Andrew Snell, my AI, hypercatastrophic model exists yet. This kind of thing. So the vain attempts to try to find stuff, ups and downs and things. And of course, the episode creation is to involve we got a good near half-hour material in, and I'll be getting the linkages up for the program. Sorry that we had a little glitch up on there. Let's put our thank you note for our patrons. There we go. We will thank you very much for our colleagues and researchers and assistant researchers and friends and legacy patrons. Can't do it without you, kids. And then we will then bring up our advert for Rocks for there. So at least we'll be able to go out with a noisy bang. There we go. Normally, our connections are fairly smooth, but once in a while, we get a little glitchies. Was apparently it, but they it reinstated. So we'll have a slightly short show. But we will have our material. We'll put our links in tomorrow after everything is finalized. Volume 2 looks to be just as deliciously massive as Volume 1. And the range of technical material and the exam things, it'll be a useful compendium for anybody that wants to get a grip on how creationism got to the spot it is and how it manages to stay out of touch with it, and how the scientific world is moving ever farther ahead, so that the creationists are so far behind the curve technically that they ain't ever going to catch up. No way, no how. And that's why we want everybody to be familiar with the sciencey stuff, because it's all directly available. So anyway, everybody stay safe. There are climate glitches in various spots. We've enjoyed the holidays as we move in, and then buckle down as we bump into January 20th, when the God King Emperor Donald the Infallible will be reinstated. The first time in American history that we've had a convicted felon as president of the United States. Isn't that a milestone? And it's going to wreak havoc on our foreign policy issues and our economics and a lot of other things. And it's going to be a bumpy 4 years to go. But anyway, don't buy crypto and kind of stay out of the stock market if you can. So anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for the wooden penguins, and we will catch you all next week.